My name is Paul Sachs, and I run North Country Organics, which is a fertilizer company in Bradford, Vermont. And I've been asked to talk about different ingredients that go into organic fertilizers. There's a few things that you'll see on slides. The OMRI insignia, it's a brand listing material review organization, and when you see it, it just means that the material that we're talking about is listed by our source, by us, or by both. But not all brands of that particular material are OMRI listed, so that's important to note. Where you see the excavator, that means that the material is mined. But it doesn't make any statement about environmental impact or claims of supply longevity. And last but not least, where you see courtesy Bruce Hoskins, University of Maine, he is the coordinator of soil testing program at the analytical lab in Orono, and in fact all of the UVM soil tests go to Orono to get done. And so, but he shared a lot of his slides with me from a presentation that he gave at New England Grows. It was a very interesting presentation, and it was very enlightening, and I'll show you one of his slides that just dispel the myth that I had been believing for 30 plus years. So, but you'll see that. You'll probably be as surprised as I was. Anyway, there's an awful lot of materials out there, and this really isn't a complete list. This is a list of stuff that we deal with and put together to make blends, either blends that we brand or custom blends. We do a lot of custom blending too. And we're going to go through this list, but not in alphabetical order like the way it's set up. We're going to go through starting with nitrogen, and then phosphorus, potassium, and so on. Okay, the first thing that's really important to understand, though, is that all the stuff that we can buy for amending our soil, for fertilizing our crops, is only amounts to about 5% of what the crop needs. The other 95% comes from air and water. So the biggest element, of course, that plants need is carbon. And the carbon comes from the atmosphere. And actually, you can start this cycle anywhere you want. It tends to go around in an endless loop. But with the help of the sun's energy, plants convert carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into different carbon compounds, carbohydrates, fats, waxes, lignins, cellulose, all kinds of different things that all other living things on this planet use for energy. And every time that energy is used, carbon dioxide is respired back into the atmosphere. And so, it's sort of an endless loop. But it's not, and the reason I say sort of is because the atmosphere is pretty big. The inner atmosphere alone is 100 miles high. So it's not, and with all the turbulence in the atmosphere, it's not all the carbon dioxide that's out there is available to plants. So plants actually, their best opportunity to get carbon dioxide is that when it seeps out of the soil. The soil has a concentration of maybe 10 times the amount of carbon dioxide that the atmosphere does. And there's an exchange between the soil and the atmosphere. Oxygen comes in from the atmosphere and carbon dioxide comes out mostly from biological activity. And also roots give off some carbon dioxide, but not a lot. It's mostly from the energy used by the biology in the soil. So the plants have these pores on the bottom side of their leaves called stomata. And those pores absorb carbon dioxide, and coincidentally those pores are open in the early morning and the early evening. And that's also the time when the turbulence in the atmosphere is at its lowest. So there seems to be some sort of intelligent design there where the wind dies down, the pores open, carbon dioxide coming out of the soil, and the plants capture it. If you go into a place like the rainforest where they have a huge canopy, very little of the carbon dioxide actually gets into the atmosphere above the canopy because most of it's trapped. But in row crops, you certainly wouldn't see that. So beginning with the big three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the way that it's labeled on a fertilizer bag is total nitrogen, available phosphate, and soluble potash. But there's also secondary macronutrients, including calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and micronutrients. There's about 6 or 7 of which that conventional wisdom considers to be essential for plant growth. However, the way they measure that is really in just production. They don't take into consideration plant defense mechanisms or anything else. And if you looked at an assay of plant tissue, you'd find there's probably 65 to 75 different elements in that plant tissue. And you have to ask yourself, if the plant doesn't need this, why is it there? So obviously the plant needs more than conventional wisdom knows. So nitrogen and protein, natural organic nitrogen and protein, are somewhat synonymous. Protein divided by 6.25 equals total nitrogen. And this is a label from a dog food bag. And you can see that there's 30% total crude protein. So if you use that formula, you'd come up with about just under 5% nitrogen. And believe me, if you were to take a bag of dog food and till it into your garden and the neighborhood dogs didn't come in and dig it up, you would actually see a response from plants, because that's what that is. And we use a lot of ingredients for nitrogen that are also feed ingredients, which is why natural organic nitrogen is so expensive, because you're competing with, or I shouldn't say so expensive, but more expensive than conventional fertilizer, because you're competing with the feed market. Peanut meal is one of those things that we don't have to compete with the feed market too much, because peanut meal is typically fairly high in aflatoxins, which to ruminants is harmful, but in the soil is completely harmless. So they consider it a fertilizer grade material. And we used this for years and years and years. We went through probably 300 to 500 tons a year, and we'd send it first to a feed mill, and they would pelletize it and crumble it, and we had a very nice consistency. But unfortunately, there's a new law out called the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, and they won't allow high aflatoxin materials through these feed mills. There's certain regulations, so we can no longer get this material pelletized and crumbled unless we want to purchase the pelletization equipment ourselves, which we might actually do. But it's unfortunate, because we didn't have to compete with the feed market with this particular ingredient. And not only did it have about 50% protein, which is 8% nitrogen, but it also had a little bit of phosphorus and potash too. And we went ahead and got an OMRI listed, only to find out we can barely use it anymore. Blood meal is a great source of nitrogen. It's about 80 to 85% protein, which translates into about 13% total nitrogen. It breaks down pretty fast in the soil. It's a great source of N. You know, blood in its natural state is liquid, so it tends to become that when it gets in contact with moisture. Unfortunately, it's also a feed ingredient with a lot of protein, and it's very expensive. In fact, it's probably per unit of N the most expensive natural organic nitrogen you can find. But you know, a lot of times we have people who use it in potting mixes, medias, and you don't have to use so much of it, because in containers you get so much more root occupation that the efficiency of use is so much higher in a container. Okay, feather meal also contains about 13% nitrogen. And this was the thing that Bruce Hoskins showed me from University of Maine. I used to think that feather meal was a really nice, slow-release nitrogen, because feathers is a chitinous protein, like your fingernails or your hair, and it doesn't break down that easily. It's very, very slow to break down. And I'd read articles for years and years about how hard it is for the protein in feather meal to be digested by animals. So So I always thought, well, this is nice, you know, especially if you're growing under row covers, you can lay down your feather meal first and then not worry about it for the rest of the year. But come to find out that the mineralization of nitrogen from protein is more a factor of the carbon to nitrogen ratio and, of course, soil temperature than it is the type of protein. And this was like, you know, if you've believed something for more than half of your life and then find out it's wrong, it feels a little embarrassing. But I don't remember all the people I told that it was slow release, that I can call them back now and say, oops, I was wrong. But we'll get into the carbon to nitrogen ratio a little bit more a little later in the talk. But you can see from this that, you know, feather and blood, basically there's just no statistical difference between the mineralization rate of those two, nor is there between soy and fish meal. The two that are down below, they have a greater, a wider carbonation ratio, and that's why they release more slowly. See, cottonseed meal is something that is kind of nice because it has nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. A lot of people have started using or have been using cottonseed meal because it has an acidifying factor, so they'll use it on blueberries and rhododendrons and things that like more of an acid soil. But when it comes right down to it, it only takes 9 pounds of lime to neutralize the acidity from 100 pounds of cottonseed meal. So you're not really changing the pH very much when you're using cottonseed meal as a fertilizer. In fact, you're not changing it at all. Poultry litter is a good ingredient. They actually do pasteurize poultry litter and use it as a feed in some cases. It's kind of disgusting, but it's not. There's so much of it that we don't really have to compete much with the feed market. So it's a very good source of nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. And unfortunately, it has an odor stigma to it that some people find insufferable. But if once you've put it in the soil, it really that odor doesn't last very long at all. My warehouse, on the other hand, smells a little differently. Alfalfa meal it's not an OMRI listed product because it's certified organic. So this is organically grown alfalfa meal, and it has some nitrogen, some phosphate, some potash. It's really not a great fertilizer for the money, but it has this growth hormone called triacontanol, which a lot of people really swear by, especially people who are growing tomatoes, peppers, any of the nightshades, and for whatever reason, I haven't been able to find any empirical evidence about triacontanol, but I hear a lot of anecdotal stories about how good it works. Now, the reason I mentioned that it's non-GMO is that a few years ago, some of the bioengineering companies came out with a Roundup-ready alfalfa, and so a lot of customers came to us and said, we can't use a GMO alfalfa meal in our soil. Well, actually, the fact is that the organic one is a non-GMO, so you don't have to worry about that. But this is the OMRI decision tree for evaluating GMO materials. And what it comes down to is if you don't get the GMO benefit from that gene, then it's evaluated as a non-GMO material. So if you take, like, for example, a GMO soybean meal, and you put it into the soil, and basically the biology in the soil is going to disassemble that, and those genes really don't exist anymore, then that's evaluated as a non-GMO. Unless you get some of the GMO benefit from that material, it's not considered a GMO input. So just so you know that. A lot of times, we don't use soybean meal, but it would be very, very difficult to find a soybean meal that you could certify as non-GMO. The same with corn gluten. Nitrate of soda, last but not least, this is a kind of a controversial material. It's a soluble sodium nitrate. It is mined in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. It's been a source of nitrate for a couple hundred years, actually. They've had wars over it. Of course, you know, as an oxidizer, it can be used to make explosives. And before the creation of ammonium nitrate and other explosive materials, Chilean nitrate was the one. So you can imagine how governments wanted to get their hands on it, and they fought over it. But one of the myths about Chilean nitrate is that it's from guano, and it really isn't. When you consider the depth of the deposit in this desert, that would be an awful lot of birds or bats making an awful lot of guano for an awful long time. It just isn't so. Another myth about Chilean nitrate is that the people who mine Chilean nitrate employ child labor. And even Michael Pollan wrote about this in his book, Omnivore's Dilemma. And it really it is a myth I'd really kind of like to dispel. First of all, the kids couldn't be trusted with dynamite. They just didn't know how to set it off right. And they couldn't drive these trucks because their feet wouldn't reach the pedals, you know. So they couldn't do any of that. They couldn't operate the payloaders or the dump truck because they weren't Tonka brand, and they don't know how to operate anything other than Tonka. And so, and they don't know how to operate these very, very complicated controls on a very modern and expensive facility. So these guys are really out of work. And if anyone in your travels tries to tell you that Chilean nitrate employs child labor, you can understand the ridiculousness of that notion. It's really quite absurd. Okay, getting to the carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is from Bruce Hoskins, and what you can see is that as you get a broader and broader difference between the carbon and nitrogen, then it slows down the mineralization of nitrogen. So anything that's under 10 to 1, you're going to get a rapid release of plant available nutrient. And that would include your blood meal and feather meal, your soybean meal, your fish meals, anything that is real low, high protein, low carbon to nitrogen ratio. When you get into the 10 to 20 range, then you get a more gradual release. And some of this might include green manure, if you turn under a green manure crop. 20 to 40 is a very slow release of available nitrogen. And 40 or more can actually tie up available nitrogen in the soil and immobilize it. If any of you have ever used like horse manure with a lot of wood chips in it, and you've tilled it into the ground and all of a sudden all your plants turn yellow, that's a perfect example of how the high carbon nitrogen ratio immobilizes available N. Because in the soil, the carbon nitrogen ratio is like 12 to 1. But if you add wood chips, which are like 400 to 1, the organisms are going to take that nitrogen so that they can use it to decompose the high carbon and balance that out. So if you go to our website, which is norganics.com, and if we have time at the end here, I'll try to show you some of the things on our website, because it's really, there's really a lot of tables and articles and generic information. Has nothing to do with our products. But if you go to our applications and technical articles, you'll see there's a carbon to nitrogen ratio of various waste materials, and that's what it looks like. So you don't have to write it down; it's there anytime you want to view it. But as you can see, some of the ones that have the higher CN ratio are actually things that you might want to cultivate into the soil the fall before you plant, so they have plenty of time to recreate that balance of carbon and nitrogen. But you can see like blood meal is 3 to 1. Feather meal, I don't know if that's in here. So yeah, feather meal's not in here, but I'd say that's probably around the same, 3 or 4 to 1. We also have this table that's called the estimated nitrogen release table, and it's based on the type of soil that you have and the amount of organic matter that you have. But one thing you have to understand about this is that it's estimated, and the estimation is because there's a lot of factors that influence the breakdown, including temperature, precipitation, humidity, and the structure of the organic matter, temperature being the most important. And Bruce, I think my next slide, yeah. Bruce talks about the Q10 factor. So for every 10 degrees centigrade that the soil temperature rises, the mineralization rate doubles. And actually, in most studies, it doubles or triples. So warm soil is a really important component of getting mineralization from protein. Okay, so nitrogen practices, this is also from Bruce, we'll go through this quickly. There's multiple, the best way is to get your multiple end sources. We try to do this in our blends so that you have a fast release and then things that are slower. But none of the ingredients we use are probably under 10 to 1, so you probably wouldn't get anything that is going to give you stuff beyond that mineralization period. But it also depends on the soil temperature. So typically in Vermont and New Hampshire, in the northern New England, if you're applying fertilizer in the spring, the soil is pretty cold. So it takes a while for it to break down and become available. We have a little bit of Chilean nitrate that we use in some of our blends, and that gives you some immediate nitrogen. Legumes are a real good, if you have the field space and you can go into rotations, legumes can provide all the nitrogen you need. You can get up to 100% of your total N requirement. It really depends on how mature your crop is. If you plant legumes in the fall and they come up and live for about 3 or 4 weeks and then turn them in the spring, chances are you're not going to get as much as if you were able to leave that crop in for 12 months. So the more mature it is, you get a little bit higher carbonation ratio, so you get a longer release. And it really does provide a nice foundation of nitrogen for the whole season. So grass will actually give you some nitrogen when you plow that down because it takes available nitrogen to grow. And so it immobilizes it, and then when you turn it in, it gives it back. But legumes actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So you're going to get quite a lot more, but you need about a 50% stand to get a decent nitrogen credit. Okay, moving on to phosphorus. One of the things that you see on a fertilizer bag is phosphate. And the difference between phosphorus and phosphate is a factor of 2.3 approximately. So, and by the way, phosphate is really PO4, not P2O5, but that's just the way the regulatory agencies want it. So that's what we have to do. So there's only a couple of sources of phosphorus that we use, although there is phosphorus in things like meal and alfalfa meal and poultry litter. But the two that are just really mostly phosphorus is going to be bone meal and rock phosphate. Bone meal is a dicalcium phosphate, so it breaks down a little more, actually a lot more rapidly than rock phosphate. And you have a much higher available phosphate. So this particular one that we use is 29% available phosphate. And part of the reason for that being so high is because it's very dusty. It's very fine. So it has a lot of surface area. The more surface area for each particle, the more exposure it has to the biology in the soil. So it breaks down more rapidly. And it also has a fair amount of calcium. Now, phosphate rock also has, it only has about 3 to 5% available, but it has about 20 to 30% total phosphate. So, and all of that total phosphate does become available over time. It isn't something that, you know, you're only going to get that 3 to 5%. So sometimes when you do an application based on 3 to 5% available, then you're going to get probably 4 to 6 years of phosphate supply out of that. And even though a soil test may not indicate that that phosphate is there, it is there because you put it there. And but the soil tests, some soil tests, especially your Morgan extracts, your Malic 3s, don't find reserve phosphorus like the stronger brays do. So, and there was a myth back in the 80s or 90s, I think it was, that we were going to run out of phosphate in the next 5 years. But from what I've gathered in the research I've done, there's a 300 to 400 year supply of it with expected population growth. Potassium, again, you know, on the fertilizer bag you see potash, you see soluble potash. So there's a lot of things that may have potassium in it, like Greensand, but it's not available, so they can't claim it. The two things that we usually deal with that have soluble potash is sulfate of potash, which contains about 51% soluble potash and about 18% sulfur. Now, in the fine form here, that's considered soluble. That will actually dissolve in water, and you can actually apply it as a liquid. But the granular form, which is how we deal with it mostly, because we get it by the rail car out of Great Salt Lake, and that doesn't, it dissolves in the soil, but it's on the low end of the solubility scale. So it's pretty slow and steady. And not only that, but potassium is one of those positively charged ions in the soil called cations, and they cling to negatively charged what they call colloidal exchange sites in the soil. And that could be clay or humus. Those are the two most common. Okay, so we also have sulfate of potash magnesia. The mineral name is Langbeinite, and that's also, a lot of people call it Sulpamag, but that's like calling facial tissue Kleenex. Sulpamag is a brand, and so is K-Mag, so we don't call it that because we're not buying it from them. Anyways, that contains 22% potash and 11% magnesium, 23% sulfur. It's a pretty good material to use if you're low in both magnesium and potassium. We don't move very much of that because in most of the soil tests we see, magnesium is high, and calcium is usually the thing that needs to be adjusted. And I think that's because that a lot of people use dolomitic lime for years and years and years. They built up that magnesium level, and plants use calcium at a much higher rate than they use magnesium. So they deplete the calcium, but not the magnesium. So there's other stuff. There's secondary macronutrients, micronutrients, and soil amendments that don't actually claim a fertilizer value, but they do have value in plant health and crop production. So the secondary macronutrients include calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So sulfur, you get sulfur in a lot of materials like sulfate of potash, that's a potassium sulfate. Sulfate of potash magnesia has sulfur. Epsom salts, which is a magnesium sulfate. Gypsum, which is a calcium sulfate. All of those things have sulfur in a sulfate form, and that's plant available. If you're applying sulfur to correct a sulfur deficiency, that has to be converted to sulfate, and it's done biologically. The soil has to be above 60 degrees or sulfur bacteria won't be active. But what they do is they basically take oxygen from water molecules and create sulfate. So if you put too much sulfur down at one time, you can actually create an anaerobic condition in your soil because those bacteria going nuts taking oxygen out of the soil. So, so that's something to be careful of. And we have on our website, if we have time I'll show you later, some calculation pages so you can actually plug in data from your soil test and it'll tell you what you need to put down to correct imbalances. So gypsum also, like I said, provides sulfur, but it also gives you calcium. The difference between gypsum and, say, calcium lime is that gypsum doesn't raise the pH. So if you need to add calcium, but you don't want to raise the pH, then gypsum is really your best choice. And this is also true of Epsom salt, which I'll get to. I didn't realize I had Aragonite in here, but Aragonite is from shells, and mostly oyster shells. And it's actually mined, but it's a renewable resource because shellfish are always, mollusks are always making more shells. And it's the action of the turbulence in the ocean that actually makes this oolitic sand that you can see these little oolites, they call them. And these are only a half a micrometer across. So they're very, very small. It looks like sand. And this is from just the waves kind of rolling over them all the time. But Aragonite has a lot of calcium in it, but it's also a liming material. So if you don't need to raise your pH, you don't want to use Aragonite. Epsom salts is, again, a source of magnesium without raising the pH. The sulfate in magnesium doesn't lower the pH either, because the sulfur bacteria don't need to convert it. It's already converted. Okay, so azomite is it's a volcanic material, and it's a source of over 70 minerals and trace elements. So it doesn't necessarily correct a trace mineral deficiency. If you need boron, or if you need manganese or zinc, you're not going to get enough of it. In fact, there is no natural material that will correct a micronutrient deficiency, which is why the NOP allows synthetic materials used, like sodium borate or zinc sulfate. These are all synthetic materials, but they do allow it as long as you can document a need for them. I think I talk about that a little later. Okay, humates is something that the conventional wisdom has been kind of playing down for a long time. I think they're starting to come around, but humates really does help plants and soil too. It has a lot. The humic acid isn't really absorbed, immediately by plant. It's not absorbed at all by plants. But what it does is it makes obscure elements, trace elements, more available to plants and soil organisms. Most of your soil organisms are microflora, which are actually in the plant family, not in the animal family. So I'm a big fan of humates, but you can overdo anything. I've never seen anyone hurt a plant or a crop from adding too much humate, but there's a point of diminishing returns. Okay, Greensand I mentioned before. It's an iron potassium silicate. It has some potassium in it. It has about 30 trace elements, but for the most part, they're unavailable. It's more of a soil conditioner because Greensand has the consistency of sand, but it holds about 10 times more water. So it'll actually condition light sandy soils. It'll also condition clay soils. Unfortunately, the one source of Greensand in the United States has closed its mine. They did it suddenly without very much notice at all. And we find ourselves going across the pond to find Greensand. And so shipping it from a foreign country makes it more expensive, but people still want it. But if you need potassium immediately, you're probably better off using sulfate of potash. Kelp meal, that's something that also is in short supply temporarily, and only because the people who harvest it have retired. It was one of those weird things where there's plenty of seaweed out there, but the main people who used to go out and harvest it just suddenly retired, and so the supply is hurting. But that's temporary. That'll come back as soon as get some new blood out there, some new boats. But kelp meal is a great ingredient. It's a feed grade source of naturally chelated trace elements and growth hormones, and it increases both the health and the vitality and production of plants and soil. Okay, so trace elements: boron, cobalt, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc. all of these are synthetic, but some are OMRI listed, but they can be used on organic farms as long as you can document the need. Now, if you're a fan of Dan Kittredge's nutrient density, the NOFA people, or I should say the VOF people, are pretty understanding of that. And correct me if I'm wrong, Greg. And so, if you have a test that says you are low in cobalt, and you're, a disciple of the Kittredge philosophy that you need some cobalt, you can show the accredited certification agency that data that your soil is low in cobalt, and Dan Kittredge says you need 2 parts per million. They will allow that, but you can't just indiscriminately add any of these things without some documentation that you need it. Okay, so there's a lot of other materials out there. You saw that list from my carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you can certainly look at those too. We don't carry any of these things. We used to use cocoa bean meal, which was kind of neat. Our fertilizers smelled like cocoa, and that we liked. And we also used coffee ground compost at one point, but the consistency of it was just, well, there wasn't any consistency to it, so we stopped using that. We stopped using compost altogether because it just wasn't dry enough to put in a bag. And we do have corn gluten meal, but we don't use it for any of our blending. It's got 10% nitrogen. It's about 63% protein. We used to use crab meal and fish meal, but crab meal is hard to get, and it's got a certain amount of oil and moisture to it that just doesn't sit well inside a bag. Fish meal, same thing. It doesn't sit well inside a bag, and it's really awful to handle. And fish meal has just such a strong odor to it, and you get it on your hands, and it takes about a week for it to go away. And every time you go like this, oh God. Anyway, hoof and horn meal, we have used that from time to time because it's a pretty good protein, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio is low enough that it releases pretty well. Some people have asked us about linseed meal, and we looked into it, but it's pretty expensive, and you don't really get your bang for your buck out of it. So, okay, biochar. A lot of people ask me about biochar. Biochar has a lot of benefits to it. It does reduce leaching and increases the cation exchange capacity. It can moderate acidity and improve water retention. And it also benefits soil organisms, but this stuff is pretty expensive. It uses a lot of energy to create it. And if you're trying to recreate a terra preta, which is the soil that they discovered in Central and South America, this was after hundreds of years of campfires and the charcoal left over from these campfires being buried in these planting sites. It does take centuries to make a terra preta. It's not something that you can just create overnight. And so there are benefits to it. If you have a postage stamp garden, go for it. But if you're farming on a larger scale, I don't really think it's cost effective. There are other ways to add, to increase your CEC and to add health to your soil. Growing sod crops is one of the best ways. You can grow organic matter. A sod crop, whether it's a legume or not, can contribute anywhere from 1/2 to 4 tons of organic matter per acre per year. So, and that has a lot of humic substances and other things that are really worthwhile. Okay, this is really not shameless advertising of my products. This site offers quite a bit of material. It's a new site that we just redid this year, and if you look at the applications tab, you see the first thing is calculation pages, and these are something we just added. In fact, we just went live this week with it. And the calculation pages include all kinds of different forms where you can put data in, and it will give you application rates for correcting deficiencies. It's important to understand that these are not crop fertility programs. These are just to recreate balance in your soil. If you're not sure where to start, you can go to the step-by-step, and that is one step at a time, and it links you to each of the calculation pages. So just see what we're doing here for time. Oh, good, we got plenty of time. So, one of the first things it'll take you to is your lime application. Now, there's several different ways that labs calculate lime application. So, a lot of them do it with an acidity factor, which is measured in milliequivalents per 100 grams. Some of them do it in the percent saturation of hydrogen and the CEC, which is the cation exchange capacity. Others will do it with a buffer solution. UVM doesn't use any of those things. They use reactive aluminum. I'm not a big fan of that because I think you tend to lime too much using reactive aluminum. But I've actually put in here a calculation form so that you can convert the information that UVM gives you into an acidity value, and then you can just plug that in. You'll probably find that it's not going to match what UVM's thing is. But if you need to lower your pH, we also have a page that allows you to put in the existing pH and the target pH, and it'll tell you, based on the type of soil you have, how much sulfur. It'll also tell you that, well, at the top it tells you really shouldn't apply more than 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet per application, and that's because we don't want the soil to go anaerobic on us. If you use too much at a time, it'll take too much oxygen out of the soil. So one of the things I'd like to say about sulfur, though, is if you get a soil test, a lot of times people show me soil tests and it says the sulfur is very low. But then you look at your organic matter, and organic matter is like 4%, 5%, or higher, even 3%. There's a lot of sulfur in organic matter, and that is where your plants get most of their sulfur. So if I see a very low in a test, but I see 5% organic matter, I say, look, don't worry about sulfur. Because the labs only test for sulfate sulfur, and they're not going to test for sulfur bound up in an organic compound. So they won't see that. Okay, so in the technical articles, there's a lot of articles and tables, very, very helpful things that we encourage people to use. And it's taken us a long time to accumulate all of these and put them into this site. Here's nutrient content of soil amendment. So if you know you need a certain amount of nitrogen or phosphorus or potash or boron or molybdenum, you can look at this table and see what's going to give you that material. Another thing we put in there is a nutrient removal table, and there's different crops that remove nutrients at different rates. And this isn't really to say that this is the exact ratio you need, but it gives you kind of an idea of how plants take this out. And at the very bottom we have an average, just in case you're growing mixed vegetables. But it's kind of enlightening to see when you have a lot of times people want a balanced fertilizer, like a 5-5-5. Well, that might be balanced in terms of numerically, but that's not balanced in terms of what plants extract from the soil. So it's really important to understand that what's balanced to a plant is not necessarily balanced to us. So, so this is a good table to reference if you like. OMRI is a great website, and they give a lot of information about different products. If somebody claims that a product is OMRI listed, the first thing I do is I go to this site and I check it and make sure it is OMRI listed and how it's listed. And they have a wonderful search engine that can find generic material. It can find brand name material. And it'll also tell you the rule. For example, if you put in a generic material like feather meal, it'll give you the information on on the generic rule for using feather meal, if there's any restrictions to it, and then it'll give you a list of all the people who have OMRI listed feather meal, which I'm not sure if there is any, but that would be there. I think it's fair for people to be able to check, kind of double check or get a second opinion on their soil tests, because a lot of these labs, it's not just UVM, a lot of these labs, they have sort of a canned, computerized recommendation thing when, certain things is a bunch of if-then algorithms and then a canned response comes out and put down this, put down that. And it isn't really an individual who is saying, you really need to look at this a different way. And to a certain extent, so is our calculation pages. One of the things that we're doing is we're not making recommendations based on crops. We're just making recommendations on soil imbalances. So in addition to these corrections, we would recommend a fertility program. We have fertility programs in our application guide, which, let's see, we'll go back to calculation page. And so if you go to technical articles here, and these are all the technical articles. Like for example, if you see in a test, and a test a lab is going to tell you, okay, your pH is 6.2 and you need X amount of tons of lime. Well, take a look first and see what crop are you growing and what pH range does this crop need. Is it something that actually needs a more acidic soil? I had somebody who is growing strawberries, and strawberries it's 5.5 to 6.0, and the lab was saying, well, you need your pH is 6.1 and you need X amount of tons of lime per acre. Well, no, you don't, not if you're growing strawberries. So it's a good idea to take a look at these tables and get this information. I'm going to jump to this site here, and we can go to these calculation pages and we can take a look at how these work. So you can see there's quite a few different ones in here. In fact, I just put in another one yesterday, convert protein to nitrogen. So if you buy something that has a feed label on it and you want to find out, well, I bought this to till into my garden or my field, and I don't know how much nitrogen is. Well, if you look at the protein, so we're going to put in the protein number. Let's just say it's 62% protein. Well, it tells you it's almost 10% nitrogen. So, so if we go back to, so the step-by-step, like I said, just goes through the entire thing, and there's all these different links to different forms as you go through each step. So if you're not sure how to start. In fact, I'd like everyone to play with these calculation pages because they're very new, and these are things that need to be tweaked, because they're new, and I can't really do that unless people try them and say, hey, I had a little problem here, and point this out to me. In fact, one of the things that I learned almost instantly is I had a guy who came into my office and I showed him this, and he said, well, where do I start? And so I said, Jay, that's a great question. So I created this step-by-step right here because, that was the first thing he said is, where do I start? And that's a great question. I forgot that, when I go look at a soil test, I know exactly where to start, but not everybody else does. So that's why I created the step-by-step. I think it was after World War II, the government was giving away superphosphate, giving it away. And so farms overloaded their soils with phosphates. And that's probably where a lot of it comes from, because like I said, phosphate doesn't move in the soil. Where you get phosphatic pollution into waterways is from soil runoff. So you're actually getting soil particles that are running off. If you could control erosion with good vegetative buffers, you'd probably cut way, way back on that phosphatic pollution. But The phosphorus, not only does it not go anywhere, but if you look at this nutrient removal table, you see that phosphorus is actually not used all that much by most plants. So, and since it doesn't go anywhere, and for the last 50 to 100 years of agriculture, we just keep putting more and more and more and more and more on. I mean, you got to remember that a lot of the extension services for a long, long time, they just had a canned thing for corn or a canned thing for soybeans or whatever it is. They just said, you know, put this down. We don't really care what the soil test says. You still need this amount of phosphorus, you know. So that's really where your buildup is coming from. The problem is that can the plants you're growing extract the phosphorus that's all locked up in the soil? And in some cases they can't, and it depends on the soil. In a sandy loam on the Connecticut River, you should be able to, as long as you have enough biological activity, because where your phosphorus becomes available to plants is in the rhizosphere, and it's because of the phosphorus solubilizing bacteria that are encouraged to be active by secretions through the roots. So, yes. Oh, did I answer? Is there a negative effect on plants to have a high level of phosphorus? Not that I know of. Really the concern is the phosphatic pollution. Yeah. Now, I have never seen any situation where phosphate is overdosing and killing plants. Now, some people say that phosphate locks up iron, calcium, magnesium, things like that, and that's true, but usually outside of the pH range, where you know, pH, if the phosphorus is most available between pH of I think it's 6 and 7. So if you're within that pH realm range, then your phosphate should be most available. Once you get above that into the 7.5 and above, then you're going to start locking up calcium. When you get below that, you're going to start locking up some of your trace elements like iron. Yes?
I was just going to add to that if you're over-applying manure or especially compost, that can actually increase the phosphorus levels, because a lot of people were managing for nitrogen for their crops with compost. But the thing is, nitrogen volatizes out, but the phosphorus doesn't. And so you can actually really build up phosphorus over time if you're only using compost or manure, especially from dairy cows.
Yeah, it's true. Because yeah, especially in liquid manures, topically applied, you volatilize a lot of nitrogen. You may lose up to half of it, but the phosphorus isn't going anywhere. Yeah. Yes?
Is there such a thing as having too much calcium in your compost?
Well, there's a balance that was developed by Albrecht, and it's a cation, it's called a base saturation, and he recommends 2 to 5% potassium, 10 to 15% magnesium, and 65 to 75% calcium. If you get too much calcium in your compost or your growing medium or your soil, then it throws the other things off. So basically what it does is it hogs the available exchange sites. And there's no way you can extract that calcium. The only thing you can do is add you know, magnesium or potassium, whatever you need, to try to recreate that balance. And it will knock the calcium off the soil colloidal exchange site, and then that calcium will bond with something, probably phosphate or something else. Terry.
I have a question about Chilean nitrate.
Okay.
So when I first started farming, I heard a lot about that they were going to take it away, that they were going to...
Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot to mention that. Back in, and Joe, you can help me with this if you... 2012, right. The NOSB, the National Organic Standards Board, thought that Chilean nitrate should be, well, for numerous reasons, they thought that it should be prohibited from organic farms. And so they dropped some annotation that allowed for up to 20% of the crop's nitrogen requirement, which essentially, because it was on the natural prohibited list with that annotation, when you drop the annotation, now all of a sudden it's prohibited. But the NOP, which is a national organic program, got a lot of pushback from farmers who felt that they needed this, a little bit of Chilean nitrate for cold soil. And so since it was supposed to sunset in October of 2012, but it didn't, and it hasn't. And is there any light at the end of that tunnel?
The official word from the NOFA is that it's stuck.
It's stuck.
Yeah.
And
yeah, taking into account lots of feedback and not quite being prepared to publish a proposed rule to amend the regulations and prohibit it totally.
right. So it being stuck, you know, it's one of those things where if it ever becomes unstuck, it would still take 6 to 12 months anyway before it actually became a rule. Since 2012, you know, we fulfill a lot of the NOFA bulk orders, and since 2012, they've asked for everything to be without Chilean nitrate. You know, all the custom blends that we make for them, and the regular blends and everything, and because they're anticipating the sky falling any minute, and they're going to be stuck with a shed full of fertilizer with Chilean nitrate, which it shouldn't be a fear, because even if they do unstuck it, then it's going to be at least a year before.
So a lot of the bags that I was buying, I get it through Garden Supply, they have the big sticker that says made without.
Yes, I have, we have, see our normal blends, the original formula has a little bit of Chilean nitrate in it. And by the way, even though that annotation is gone and you're actually allowed to use more than 20% of the nitrogen requirement, we use less than that in our blends. Our blends have, where we do use Chilean nitrate, it's always well under 20% of the total nitrogen. So, but yeah, there's a lot of people who are still thinking that any minute now that rule's going to change and I'm going to be stuck with this stuff. All right, I think we've run out of time here. So hopefully I gave you some useful information. And please visit my website and use the calculation pages and let me know if you find any problems with it. You can, thank you. You can email me at info@norganics.com.